Hello, I'm Mike, and I'm going to be answering the question about describing in my own words my mental health experience of distress. Second time I've recorded this. The first time I couldn't keep coherent and I went on way too long, so I'm going to try and be a bit more focused this time. It's a slightly strange experience for me to be recording this. It wasn't my plan when I set up this project, but when I was asking other people to volunteer to do contributions, I was sort of quite rightly pulled upon the idea that if I'm asking other people to do this, I should do it myself. So the reason why I struggled first time around, I think, is working out where to start in the story. And what I've decided to do is just be focused on the things that I think have felt the most difficult for me. So I'm a psychologist myself. I'm a clinical psychologist. I'm an academic lecturer at university, and I'm in a job which I'm incredibly happy with and feel very lucky for. But right now it's September 2017, and I want to go back to almost exactly this time a year ago, 2016, the start of the academic year. And really, although there was lots of things that I could think about and talk about that went back further than that, it's at that point that things really reached a point, the sort of point where I need to remove my cat, where I feel like I need to talk about that more now. It was about August a year ago when things reached a point where I felt like I was kind of in something of a crisis and I knew things needed to change. So what I remember about that point is that I'd had a long summer holiday, as you get to do if you're lucky. In academia I'd had 4 weeks off, and I was going back to work, ready to start a new course. I was leading on a new course that we'd set up, and it was the first time I'd run. And I was absolutely paralysed by an overwhelming fear about what that was going to be like. Not just that, other aspects of my job as well, but I think it was part of it. I remember the night or two before I went back, I found myself just talking to my wife about it and just breaking down. I was sobbing on the kitchen floor about it, quite frankly, for probably a good hour or so, because it was just this deep sense within me of how hard things were going to be. And I know on the face of it that doesn't sound like much, but it's more that was the point. The reason I'm starting there is because that's the point where I made the decision, as my wife said at the time, that I needed to get help with how I was feeling and what was going on, because this was one aspect of the things that had been building up for a long time. Over the course of the next 6 months, I experienced difficulties in a way that I'd never had anything of that intensity. I found that it got to a point where the darkness, which is the only words that I find helpful for describing what's going on, I'd have this sense of darkness that would start. I could wake up in the morning feeling okay, but something could trigger it. Any fairly small thing could trigger it, and immediately this feeling would start. And the only way I can describe it is by thinking about it. What really surprised me about this was the pure physicality of it. So I call it a darkness because what I felt was like that feeling you get when you're 9 years old and you're playing in goal and you get a football right in your solar plexus and you're winded. Right in that depth there, it was like there was a black hole. It was like there was this thing that was just sucking all of my energy. It was sucking all of my enjoyment. It was sucking it felt like everything was just slowed down because it was all being pulled into this thing, and it really, really bloody hurt. It was horrid. And what would happen is that I'd get that feeling, and it would last the whole day until I eventually got to sleep. Part of the thing for me is that I've always been somebody that no matter sort of what's going on inside, I tend to still be able to kind of function, to kind of get on with what needs to be done, as it were, looking after kids, preparing lectures, delivering lectures, all of that kind of stuff. So I was still, I think for a lot of people who perhaps knew me at this time, I think recognised that I was a bit stressed, but I don't think would have realised quite how much pain I was going through. But yeah, I think over the course of 3-4 months, it just gradually got more and more and more overwhelming. We were, at the time as well, there was stuff going on for us as a family that was really hard for everybody involved. And I just didn't really know what to do. I knew I needed to get therapy or counselling or something, and I agreed that I would do, but because of this other stuff that was going on, I kind of thought, I'll wait for that. By the time I got to that point, I wasn't completely, I was just desperate, really. I'd got to a point where life just felt too painful. Thing that's scariest, that was worst about it, or the most painful part of it, was that I'm father to three kids, so I called under the age of 10, and I couldn't stop myself from thinking about the possibility that what I was going through was somehow going to be passed to my children. That I was going to be responsible for my kids having a life that was going to be filled with this horrible feeling as well, and that everything I was doing meant that was going to be. And the truth is, by this point, it wasn't that I believed. As far as I knew, I was absolutely convinced that I was a failure. That I was not just a failure, that I was pretty much harmful in every area of my life. So for my kids, they would be better off with pretty much any man other than me as a dad. That my wife would be better off with pretty much any other man than me as a husband. That in my work, many people would be able to do that better than me, and that people deserved to have better than me. And that all fed in with this awful feeling that I had, and the way this was going on. So looking back, I was very lucky, because I'd reached this point where if something could have happened, if I could have died without people knowing that I had, that it had been me who'd done that, then I would have taken that, because A, of how painful I felt, and B, that I knew that would make the world a better place. Where I was lucky is that I was still able to recognise that I was unable to find any way that could happen without people knowing, and that even though I knew that my wife would be better off without me, I knew that she wouldn't realise that, and therefore I would actually make her life worse by not being there. Likewise for my kids and so on. And so I was lucky that my mind took me that way, and that protected me, because even at my most desperate times, my times when I was in times when everyone around me was really happy, I was at family events and everything was really good, and all I could think about was how I didn't belong there, and it would be better if I wasn't there, I didn't deserve to be there. And I'd find myself trying to fantasise about ways to make what I knew needed to happen. And I never found that way, and I never found a way that made sense in my head to do that. and I'm really lucky about that, because then I did start my therapy, and other stuff happened, which I'm going to talk about in my next video, that moved things on for me, and I think that looking back now, I'm so incredibly grateful, and I'm in a very different place, very different place now. But yeah, I think that probably gives the best picture I can of what for me was the worst point in my well-being. Okay, so now I want to respond to the question about if anything's helped or made things worse along the way. Easiest to talk about things that have made things worse. Perhaps in the well, no, I'm going to start with that, because really that's I feel like I had a huge, it wasn't a dip, a catastrophic fall. Before then, I've had something that has been a thankful recovery, really. So there's lots of things that I could talk about that I've kind of got some awareness of probably where things have happened in my life, or things about my life going back a long way that I know or believe contributed to how I got to the situation I did do. I was in a situation where there was some combination of things about not thinking it's a good idea to really talk to anybody about how I'm feeling for myself, which is absolutely ridiculous for a psychologist whose trade is built upon the idea that actually it's very useful to talk to people. But I couldn't. I found it really hard to do that for myself. I couldn't do that for myself. I didn't, and that's something that I really hadn't done very well, possibly for most of my life. In combination with the fact that I think I'd actually kept going for as long as I had done before reaching the crisis that I spoke about in my first video. I'd kept going that long because I was constantly striving. I had this idea that as long as I was working to be the best at whatever, then that was okay. It could be tolerable that I wasn't doing as well as I thought I should be, because I was working towards the best, and that included being best dad, best husband, best psychologist, best lecturer, best researcher, whatever it be, best human, frankly. I had these, but the thing that wasn't helpful for me was that I had those standards that I kept on striving for, and there was something that happened that made me realise I wasn't meeting those standards. And before I'd got to the chance of realising it was bloody stupid to have those standards, I guess I'd fallen into the darkness that I spoke about before. It's weird, because one of the things that actually, although I said before, I kind of, it was a year ago, I had this kind of like breakdown thinking about what lay ahead of me for when I went back to work. And it was at that point that I decided that I was going to access therapy. I didn't start any therapy for over 6-7 months after that period, 7-8 months. And something about knowing that I was going to be doing that actually made things worse for me. I think it almost, like, having made that decision sort of opened the floodgates, and that acceptance that I wasn't keeping it together anymore meant that the one thing that I knew how to do, which was to keep myself in and just keep the strong front going, I wasn't doing, at least for myself. And that then meant, I think, that these kind of floodgates opened, and these overwhelming feelings overtook. And I don't know if they would have ever happened if I hadn't reached that decision. And I don't think it was wrong that I decided to do that, but it's just, for me, it's been interesting to notice that, and when it fits from the other side of the chair, thinking about how people have to wait for the help that they need for all sorts of reasons, only one of which may be their own issues of the sort I'm talking about, and many of which will be to do with the way services are set up or funded or whatever it would be. I think that's it brings a stark reality to me of just how awful that is. So those are the things that sort of really made things worse. What helped was, it's undoubted that actually the decision that actually once I'd started my counselling, it made a huge difference to me. I'm incredibly lucky. I'll talk more in the video about services, but I'm incredibly lucky that I didn't actually, because of stuff that I've gone through before in my professional training, I think that's why I actually ended up not needing a huge amount of actual sessions in the therapy. So I remember the first couple of sessions I had were remained really scary because I just didn't know how to. I couldn't see how this was going to make a difference, and all I could see was stretching out in front of me at least probably another 16 years of feeling this awful until all my kids were grown up, and then I'd know that it would no longer be more harmful than not for me to kill myself. But that process, starting therapy, I'm so glad that I did do, because it then meant that changes happened. And there's stuff there about what the counsellor did, undoubtedly, with the way that he listened and things of that sort. What I think actually made the most difference for me was that I then, having started this counselling, having begun to face things myself, there was after one particular session where I'd left with this dreadful sense of what was going to happen, and I remember sitting, deciding not to get my tram, my bus home immediately, because I thought I need to think about something. I need to do something, and being sat there waiting to work out, and this sounds really petty, but it was a massive thing for me to not be doing the next thing, getting the bus home as soon as I could, to be doing what I need to do, all this kind of stuff. So stopping, and then at that point I called a friend who I'm very lucky, because I've got some good friends from going back to my childhood days that I was able to have some trust in, and I knew this guy had also been through stuff. I didn't know exactly what. We'd never really spoken about it in a very open kind of way, but somehow I knew that he would be able to listen to me. So I called him, and I told him something of what, it's funny, I didn't tell him quite how devastating, but I just told him that I was struggling. And then over the next couple of days we spoke a couple of times, and he's a father of kids as well, and he goes through these doubts about himself in a different kind of way, but I don't know, that reaching out to a friend and being listened to by a friend, and a friend who before, when he could tell that I was calling and that I had stuff to say that was really hard for me to say, he just said, he was able to immediately go, look mate, whatever it is that's going on, you don't have to tell me, or you can tell me whatever, but just know that, we can all go there in different ways, we've all been there in different ways, and I don't know, there's just something about the way he was with me that made it feel okay, and somehow gave me permission to be able to consider the alternative ideas about to where my mind was at that point. The fact that I was absolutely set on being of net harm to the world and everyone around me, and that somehow, not that he did any mind-changing strategies or anything of that sort, it just opened up the possibilities for me, and that was the thing really. That was the biggest catalyst then to the change for me, and the recovery. From then on, I've, where possible, also continued to talk openly to people people who I could trust, and now obviously more people. I don't know if I can trust you. I hope so. But I think that kind of openness and being able to talk to other people, and importantly actually with this group of friends that I have, kind of since I started talking a little bit about it, actually it's incredible how many of these also white, middle class, British, mid-30s sort of men are prepared to and able to relate to the feelings that I've been speaking about, and be able to share and help each other in that way, which is, I guess, surprised me and been really good. I think that it helped that I was able to make decisions to see about being able to do things differently and recognise where things came from. And for me, that's what unlocked being able to start the recovery. Okay, so in this next video, the task is to talk about my experience of engaging with services, which is it's going to be a fairly short one for me actually, because I have a lot more experience being on the other side, being the service that people are trying to engage with, and trying to be part of that as a clinician and as part of a service, working out how to help people engage with us. The help that I got through work. It was in this year. It was in these months after I knew that I needed to get help, but I didn't quite know what to do. I didn't know how to do it. Didn't know if we could afford for me to get therapy. All of those kind of things that were reasons why I was there was reasons why I wasn't going to do it, or reasons why I kept on putting it off. And then an email came around from my work basically saying that there is this occupational health, there's this staff wellbeing opportunity available. You can automatically have up to 6 sessions of counselling through this, if you need to, and it's self-referral, and we won't, all of that kind of thing. And I think, it was following up on that, bit frustrating that, they talk about having 6 sessions, and then the first step is to have a telephone screening, and it turns out that's one of your 6 sessions, and it's not with the person you're going to go on seeing and everything, which I personally think that's a bit of a rubbish way of putting things, but maybe that's just me with my professional hat on. But yeah, then I guess I was able to. I spoke to this woman. That was really weird. It's really weird how, so they clearly have this like telephone triage kind of idea. So I spoke to this woman for about half hour. We'd arranged a time she would call me. And that wasn't good actually, because I knew that this was the first step for me in opening up and opening myself up, and that step in me accepting I needed help and taking the steps to get help. But I could tell, again, possibly because I'm a professional, I could tell that her job was to establish whether I needed that help or not, and what kind of help that needed to be, and whether they could do it, and all this kind of stuff. And so I was trying really hard to say what I thought was the issues for me and what was going on, and I didn't feel that, because we only had a half-hour conversation, and clearly that's all the time that she had allotted to give to me. I kind of got to the end of that, and again I was just, I cry a lot, or I cry a lot in the story anyway, and I remember just lying on bed and sort of sobbing for sort of like 10-15 minutes, and all of that horrid feeling was probably I think that was probably the worst. It really started a new period of low for me and went worse from there on. The problem being that after that conversation, I then needed to see a different therapist, face-to-face therapist. I needed to work out how that was going to work with my work hours and my home commitments and all of that kind of stuff, and it actually ended up being a couple of months before my counselling started, from having that conversation, mainly because I was, we had a family holiday planned that meant I was going to be away for 2 weeks, and because I was only going to have 5 sessions with this counsellor, he was saying, well, it's best to start when we can have that consistent thing going on. And actually that period, even though I'm not actually complaining about the service I received, but I'm just aware that period of sort of like 3 months or so between first telling my story to a professional and then getting to engage with somebody who was really going to help me, because the first person, she wasn't there to help me, she was there to work out whether somebody else could help me. That period was actually the worst period for it, and I think, again, for me personally, highlighting the fact I was going to access services almost made it, brought to light quite what was going on for me. And again, it makes me question, because I've been part of services where what we do is we have an assessment and then try to signpost on, and this is it's an incredibly frequent thing in mental health services. There's probably a majority of services of one sort or another work in this way, although my most recent team doesn't, thankfully, but where you do an assessment and then establish, yeah, this person does need help, okay, and then there's a mini waiting list to find the right. And actually, I've never been quite so aware of how hard that period would be. But I was really lucky because this was available through my work. I was lucky because I was able to make use of a fairly short intervention. Now, because I'm a clinical psychologist, I've done so much work around self-awareness. We have things called reflective practice groups throughout our training. You have your clinical supervision, and it's beholden upon you to develop a self-awareness. So I had a pretty good framework of understanding my psychological patterns, or many of my psychological patterns. I knew about the traps, I knew about where things from my family history and my childhood, my background and so on, informed the way I am now. So I had quite a detailed framework for understanding that. What I didn't have was a linkage between that whole framework and the way I was feeling. And what happened was that while this blackness, this darkness was overwhelming me, really, I had all of this feeling going on, and there was no linkage for me between that and this. And so I was just overwhelmed by that. Now, what the counselling did for me was it enabled me to actually remember this stuff, draw the two together, and go, oh, okay, right. So in fact, there is. I can see where this has come from, and in fact, because I know that, I can see something different about where my life is now from all that kind of stuff. Now, so I was incredibly lucky that 5 sessions was enough for me, because actually what I needed was not building this. I just needed to link those two things together. I don't know what would have happened if I didn't have that. And I suppose that's something that is really interesting, because I was in a workplace where I had 5 sessions paid for, after which I would have had to pay for anything else myself. I don't know how well I would have been able to access NHS services and so on. And I think so I've been very lucky that way. I've been frankly quite very privileged that way. I don't know what would have happened for somebody who was feeling like I was but didn't have that knowledge, that intellectual knowledge to fall back on, to draw together with the emotional experience and so on. So I think that's again something that I'm just very aware of being important for me to be grateful for. By the way, I'm sorry that wasn't short at all. Okay, so for this video I'm meant to be talking about advice to psychologists working with people with my kinds of distress, or my kinds of experiences. I suppose that the best thing for me to do in that is think about what was actually useful for me in the counselling I did access relatively brief though it was. It's a bit of a weird one because I suppose as a therapist myself, I guess I had a fairly specific kind of take on being in there. I suppose if you were I mean that's one thing, if you were a therapist working with a therapist, I don't think, I think it's probably a good thing, as we did, to acknowledge the fact that that could be create a slightly weird dynamic. One of the things that I had to work really hard to do was not let myself get distracted by thinking about what he was doing as a therapist and what I knew about what therapists do, and letting that be a defence against me thinking about the point of being there, which was actually to feel better in myself. So I suppose it's important for things like that to be acknowledged in therapy, and in that sense, I think it's always a valid point to start with acknowledging what might be hard about accessing therapy, what the particular contexts are, acknowledging the fact that you're the fact we're both male or whatever that context might be. I'm trying hard here not to just get into me thinking about what I'd be saying as a supervisor and actually thinking as someone who's used therapist. So I suppose the things that that I remember noticing made a real difference for me were, I think, being prepared to acknowledge and apologise when you get something wrong. There was a particular moment where I think I was talking about, he'd asked me whether I spoke to one of my friends about how I was feeling and stuff like that, and my thoughts about myself, particularly about my expectations about I should be the best at whatever, all of these kinds of things, and I got into a conversation about how with one of my best friends we could talk about things, but we tended to talk about it in a very intellectual way, and that we both acknowledged the ultimate limitations on knowledge of truth, and that we would use that kind of as a reason sometimes to go, yeah, well, this is what I think, but actually, of course, I could be wrong. And he referred to that as being quite a neat way of avoiding, or a neat way of maintaining this cycle. And I remember being a bit pissed off with that and kind of saying, I don't think I do it deliberately. And he immediately, or pretty much immediately, responded with, no, I don't suppose you do. I can see how you don't. There was just something which basically said, which recognised that, okay, what he'd done there was something that hadn't, I think he'd tried to talk about it in a particular way that he thought would match with how I was feeling at that point. I made it very clear to him that I didn't, and then he acknowledged that and allowed us to move on. I think that was important. It's important to acknowledge when you've got it wrong. Always important to acknowledge when you've got it wrong, and show that you're actually that you're prepared to learn about what the person in the room has to say. That felt important to me. I think the other thing that was useful for me in particular, and whether that would just be a thing for me, I don't know, or whether it be relevant for other people, is that things that he observed, he was prepared to bring into the room. Basically, he was prepared to make sure that he recognised and spoke about it with me. One example being the fact that when I'd gone along in the third session or whenever it was that I sort of like past a point where suddenly things had clicked into place for me in a different way, and I was able to feel better about myself and recognise the link that I've spoken about in one of my other videos. And there was a couple of things there that he observed about me in the room that day, and compared with what he'd observed about me in the room in the previous couple of sessions, including, I suppose, kind of obvious things like how I was speaking, my tone of voice, my rate of voice, that kind of thing. He kind of said, yeah, I really notice how you're talking in a different way. You seem to be a lot more animated. There seems to be more energy, things of that sort. But also there was very particular things, and because as I was talking about my wife, in the first instance I'd basically, I always refer to, have always referred to her by a shortened version of her name, not exactly a nickname, but a more affectionate, shorter version of her name. And he said to me in this session, he goes, "It's interesting because you're calling her that this time, but the first two sessions you referred to her very formally," and he said you used full version of her name. Obviously, he was actually saying the name, but I'm choosing not to share that right now. The point being that was when he said that, it was one of those kind of details. I couldn't believe that I would have spoken about her in that using her full name. It was a real kind of like, there was just something about that made me think, bloody hell, what was going on for me that I would use that name rather than the way that I always talk about her when I'm talking to her, when I'm talking to other people about her. I always call her. The point is that there was something about really noticing the detail and sharing it with me, and he wasn't saying it showed, he wasn't kind of being smug about it, he wasn't showing how that it definitely showed something. It was just sharing it with me as well. Is this interesting? Is this relevant? Or perhaps it's a useful way of noticing that things have changed. And I think that was a good thing to do. I think if there was one thing that possibly I'd preferred was done, and I think I don't know, he never directly asked me about suicidality, which really was the thing that for me was really kind of where I was at. And there'd been an argument that he left things open for me and I didn't go down that route. I personally think that sometimes it's important to actually ask about the thing that might be the worst place that someone is. And I suppose that maybe that's something that I would say. Actually, I'd encourage therapists, I think, from my experience of having been in the other chair, that I wish he'd asked me, because I think I would have liked to have been able to talk about it with him. I think I would have felt safe if I'd been able to talk about it with him. But I didn't feel like I had a whole thing at the time of worrying that I was just basically some middle-class white boy with first world problems. You might be watching this thinking that I was, which is fine if you do. But I suppose I was sort of not wanting to, I don't know. The point is that if I'd been asked, if I'd been asked directly, I think I would have said, and I think I would have liked to have been able to talk about that, and I didn't do because I wasn't asked, and that would be something that I think I'd say as advice is always to be mindful of what might be the worst fear in someone's mind, and actually ask, even if you don't ask explicitly, even if you don't guess what that fear is, actually maybe ask that question about what is the worst thing for you at the moment, what's your worst fear, or something of that sort, which might help people to share with you the thing that they feel like they need to talk about but might be afraid to do so. Okay, so for this question, I'm going to talk about respond to the question about whether gender's had any effect in my experiences. This is something which I've chosen to respond to largely out of responsibility for this whole project, because in the end, I'm the only male contributor in this first phase. And because one of our other contributors wanted to talk about gender, I felt like it was important that be something that I'd respond to. I think it's really interesting, and again, this is one of these things where perhaps it's hard for me to talk about without without and separate myself from my position as a psychologist and a therapist myself. I said something in the last video about worrying that I was just some middle class white boy with first world problems, and I think that I still, when I hear about other people's experiences, and when we think about some of the other experiences that are on some of our other contributors to this project have spoken about, I'm really aware that actually the number of things that are likely to have affected me over my life are much lower as a result, or it feels that way, as a result of being male compared to female. I think the knowledge of what girls and women are more likely to have experienced, and my own understanding of how the society we live in and the patriarchy of that society really puts women at such disadvantage from the word go. I think that I kind of I'm really aware that actually, through all that, I've found things really difficult. I kind of almost have that sense of, well, it could have been so much worse, and it probably you're probably very lucky that it wasn't worse, because you've had far less of those kind of things to contend with that I think a woman by my age probably has done almost as a default. I think some of what that does is it possibly contributed, or it didn't cause me to delay in actually accessing support and therapy, because I think that delay came from other characteristics that I've had for over my life and developed over my life. But I think it contributed to that thing of also being aware. I like to kind of think of myself as sort of like, I think that probably an ally to feminism is probably the best way of putting it, and aware of these kind of prejudices and privileges that almost then contribute to that sense of, well, what you're going through can't be that bad. It's not as, it can't be as bad as what a lot of people have done, what a lot of people go through. And I think that was something that actually contributed to why I didn't come forward. What I think I see now is that I realise that I guess I probably had an intellectual understanding of, but now a lot more personal understanding, including experience now, having spoken to friends, as I've said before, that belief that you don't talk about the stuff as a man can come from different places. It can come from, I think the typical idea is there's this idea that you have to be strong as a man, which I think was possibly part of what was there for me. My ideas about being the perfect husband and perfect dad were undoubtedly mixed in with that idea, gender identity of that being part of the role that I was meant to take and what that role looked like, even though my ideas of that role were in many ways a modern concept of maleness, very different from the more typical concepts that you hear about sometimes of, you go back to the post-war kind of stuff and all that. So I kind of think I've got a relatively modern idea of what a man should be, which includes actually that sharing responsibility and all of those kinds of things. But in itself, trying to do that seemed to be something which brought with it pressures about actually what I could share and when I should share, and that affected me in some ways. How else did gender have any effects on me? I don't know. I think the fact that it it took a tipping point, a crisis point for me to actually talk with my friends about what was going on for me, and for us to open up that conversation says something about I think our gendered way of talking. And this is something that I've spoken about with my wife, about how actually perhaps if I and my friends had a more general tolerance and expectation that you do just talk about how you're feeling and so on, rather than the very kind of banter focused, light-hearted stuff. I suspect that I if I'd had that kind of conversation a lot earlier, then probably I don't think I would have ever developed my difficulties wouldn't have ever developed as severely as they did do. So I guess for me those are some of the ways in which gender affected the way that I suppose my difficulties developed. But it's awful. I really just don't feel like I can finish without acknowledging that I feel like I've had life a lot better and a lot easier through being a man, and I don't know how to finish other than leaving it there. Okay, so my final recording for the project, we're given an open topic, and I wanted to talk about specifically my experiences of being in the situations I was, being a psychologist, being a therapist myself. There's things about this that I've alluded to in my other videos, but it feels like it's worth recognising in itself. See, as a clinical psychologist, certainly in my training, I believe, I don't think there are any UK clinical psychology training courses where it's mandatory to undertake your own therapy. I may be wrong in that, but that's certainly what I believe to be the case. And in my training, they were good about the idea that you might do therapy, and they were good about the talking about where it could be available and so on. But there isn't, in my experience, a professional expectation that you'll have been through that. I think that the way I see this is that it goes along with a certain professional identity. I think psychology can lead towards of a confidence that leads into overconfidence, that leads into possible arrogance, that because to do ClinPsych you have to be very academically strong in that sense. And I think that we overestimate, in my opinion, how much our academic understanding of human distress can be relied upon for informing our work with other people in distress, with people in distress. To me, there's something, as I've already said, I was, having been a psychologist was incredibly helpful for me in my recovery from where I was. I've done a lot of reflective practice. I had a really good idea about myself and about my inner psychological workings. But it was a very conceptual, it was a very cognitive, it was a very academic understanding of myself. I have written myself out as a case study in any number of ways. I had never really appreciated the emotional connection. I'd never explored that to the full degree of what all of that formulation of my family background and my family relationships and my experiences and how they all came together to inform who I was now, I hadn't ever really taken that into the depth of emotion. And I'll acknowledge it, that could have actually been a failing in myself as a trainee and a subsequent psychologist, that I hadn't done that, and maybe I've not quite embraced reflective opportunities and supervision in the way that other people do. But I suspect not. I kind of think that's something about the profession, and I, having now been in the depths of how strongly you can be overtaken by these feelings, by these experiences, it's kind of made me think that I think that all psychologists possibly should be have an experience of therapy at some point. I think that, like in so many other areas of psychotherapy, it possibly should be part of the core expectation of clinical psychology training. Because it was actually, as I've said in my other videos, it was through the process of knowing that I was going to access therapy that actually unlocked a lot of these things for me. I think if I hadn't made that decision, some of this would have just carried on and on and on, and I'm not sure I would have necessarily come to the depths I would have done, but I'd have continued in this not very harmful or healthy or helpful kind of way of thinking about myself and about my world. And so I've got a belief, having been through it, that actually I've got a greater depth of awareness of myself, having been through therapy, than I ever had done, because for all that very comprehensive formulation I had of myself, the really significant bit that was missing was some of the emotional connectedness. I don't think I could draw that emotional connectedness until I'd allowed myself to experience it, and I didn't allow myself to experience it because of all these defences I put up around me, which I knew about, and this is the thing, I knew about some of those defences, but knowledge isn't enough in itself. I think it's about being able to let yourself pass those defences, which is an intense thing to do, which can't happen in a reflective practice group, which isn't actually the purpose of supervision, to the extent that you do in therapy, and which I think, having been through there, I believe actually makes me better as a therapist, or can make me better as a therapist. And that's not to subscribe to the idea that you can only help someone if you've been through what they've been through. I don't believe that, because I believe that everybody is so individual that if you take that to its logical conclusion, no one can help anyone, and that's a nihilistic view that I simply cannot accept. Also because I think that there's a lot about the human relations and relationships that any kind of therapy can work on. But I do think that for all I believe, I've always worked with a sense of actively trying to hold compassion and empathy for people and what they were going through. I think that what I've now been through, having been through therapy myself, enhances that. I feel a lot stronger in that, and I wish I'd been there more. Of course, the question with that then is, would that have made any difference? I've been qualified 10 years, literally. I've just recently passed the anniversary of my 10th year that I qualified. Worked for 5 years as a trainee and an assistant psychologist before then. Would I have done anything hugely different in any of my casework, any of the people I've worked with over those years? I don't know. And that in itself is the reason then to go, or why advocate therapy? I just think that there may have just been one or two ways in which somehow that shared understanding of what some people were going through might have given something a little bit different. I've always been quite a strong advocate of trying to. I hate the way that services that I have been involved in have waiting lists, managing things, all that kind of stuff. I've always tried to take a service user focus as strongly as possible and try to advocate that changes where I've had power to do so. Would I have done it more if I'd been on the end of things that I have done? Possibly. I might not have rested as I may have simply not rested about it. I think I've always advocated, but perhaps I haven't. Perhaps I wouldn't have ever rested until I'd achieved what I wanted to. In that sense, would I have done assessments different? You know, I've been in a situation now where suddenly I really know how it is to feel, to not feel, to believe and to know in yourself that your life is not worth living and that the better thing for the world is for you to not be there, for you to die. Now I've probably had over 100 times when I've had some kind of assessment of somebody's self-harm or concerns around suicidality. And I believe the way I've approached those, and I believe the way the decisions I've made. There's nothing about what I've been through now that makes me worried that I have made bad decisions in any of those, or wrong decisions. I think I've always acted in best faith, and I believe that that's as best as I could do, had the right outcome for those people. But I do, for that aspect in particular, I do really think that having been there would have given me that different insight into what people might be thinking. And I think just that full awareness, again, I had a conceptual awareness that it's not about rational decision making and all of that kind of stuff. That's not how things work. I always knew that. But now I've really experienced that. And I think that I probably wish I'd had that in those assessments and at those times. Yeah. So I suppose I'd end this one with just really wanting to encourage people who aren't sure about it and people who are tempted to go on the argument of no, it's better not to go for therapy and so on. But actually, I, having now been a psychologist for 10 years, wish that I'd been through therapy over 10 years ago. And I think that might have made me a little bit of a better psychologist, as well as the fact that it would have undoubtedly helped me to not get to where I did get to.